Welcome to the Carnegie Council. Our speaker this morning is Allison Stanger. She is the Russell Leng Class of 60 Professor of International Politics at Middlebury College, and she is also the director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs. Professor Stanger will be discussing her book, One Nation Under Contract, The Outsourcing of American Power and the Future of Foreign Policy. Outsourcing is a word that you've heard often. Although there is a popular belief that outsourcing is a recent phenomenon, it's been in existence for quite some time. Typically, companies have been known to outsource those functions that are considered non-core to their business or which needed specialized skills unavailable in the open market. Lately, outsourcing has been the subject of many debates, not only because of the transfer of U.S. businesses to India and China, but also for the proliferation of private companies providing a wide array of government services. These services range from military advice and training to operational and logistical support of our troops, to homeland security protection, drug interdiction, intelligence, and granting of international aid, and more. In One Nation Under Contract, our speaker breaks new ground in describing how the emergence of joint ventures between the government and private sectors is transforming government accountability and diplomacy. She tells us that the requisite government expertise to implement foreign policy, whether in defense, diplomacy, or developmental aid, is no longer viable. A new approach is essential. She writes that outsourcing as presently practiced is scandalous, but turning the clock back so that government is in control is no solution. Instead, our speaker advocates for government to reaffirm its role as chief custodian of the public interest. Professor Stanger would like to see the executive branch discover new ways of encouraging private actors to be more responsible, while at the same time she argues for more government oversight, especially in this information age. In exploring the impact of outsourcing, Professor Stanger has found private contractors everywhere and concludes that the very definition of power in the 21st century has changed. While outsourcing has its problems, it can also be a source of creative, bottom-up initiatives with a positive foreign policy impact. Moving forward, we need to make sure this happens. To learn how, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to a very delightful guest, Allison Stanger.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I really appreciate it. Washington's dysfunction is on everyone's mind in the run-up to the November 2010 midterm elections. Government that does not serve the American people obviously has profound ethical implications. Well, why have special interest and money so completely captured our politics? I want to suggest to you here today that the problem is more than the role of special interest lobbying and campaign contributions. One big reason that's unacknowledged that money has been able to carry the day is because our government today is but a shadow of its former self. The size of the executive branch workforce in 2008, that is, the federal workforce, was the same size as it was in 1963. Yet the federal budget in that same period of time has more than tripled, adjusted for inflation, and the population has doubled. That enormous gap, in part, is filled by contractors. A firm like Lockheed Martin is today doing more than servicing weapon systems. It also sorts your mail, tallies up your taxes, cuts Social Security checks, counts people for the U.S. Census, runs space flights, and monitors air traffic. That we have become one nation under contract means that there is no longer any vigorous and disinterested government to turn to for help. The business of government is increasingly in private hands. When government work becomes private sector activity, governance itself becomes opaque, since contracts are considered proprietary information. The underside to the sweeping privatization of government power has become all the more apparent as the gap between the fortunes of Wall Street and of Main Street has widened. Since virtually every contract and grant represents jobs in some representative's district, focused lobbying can deliver bigger and bigger rewards. Special interest campaign contributions make the difference in every re-election campaign with predictable consequences. The rapidly spinning revolving door between government and business is a standing invitation to corruption. The one interest that goes underrepresented in this mix is the public interest. My book focuses on a smaller slice of this puzzle. It tells the story of how contractors came to dominate our foreign policy across the so-called 3 Ds of defense, diplomacy, and development. And it argues that while the core business of foreign policy has fundamentally changed, our strategies and our frameworks for thinking about it have lagged behind. The result is that outsourcing as presently practiced is scandalous, but turning the clock back and reasserting top-down government control, tempting though it may be to many people, is no solution. Contractors, I argue, are not the problem. The absence of good government is. From a foreign policy perspective, turning the clock back is no solution because the threats of the 21st century differ so radically from those of the Cold War. So a whole-scale reinvention, if you will, of what we mean by foreign policy is therefore required. We don't need a new prescription for our glasses. I argue we need a whole new eye chart. We need to change the things we see. When we talk about the outsourcing of American power, we immediately bump up against Iraq and Afghanistan because Iraq and Afghanistan are our first 2 contractors' wars. According to the Congressional Research Service, contractors in 2009 accounted for 48% of the Department of Defense workforce in Iraq and 57% in Afghanistan. Now, just to give you a sense of comparison, at the height of the Vietnam War, contractors constituted about 14% of the American presence on the ground. Today, the overwhelming majority of the American presence on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan are contractors. In 2010, just this year, contractor deaths have exceeded the number of military ones. So when we think of contracting as a tactical foreign policy issue, it has in reality become a wholly strategic one. Consider this if I haven't convinced you already. If you look at the Department of Defense's budget in 2008, 82% of that budget went out the door in contracts and grants. 83% of the State Department's requested budget did the same. And the relevant figure for the United States Agency for International Development is a whopping 99%. These numbers mean that the core business of foreign policy has really changed. In February of this year, the Department of Homeland Security revealed in hearings before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs that it has more contractors. It has 200,000 contractors and 188,000 civilian employees. Senator Lieberman at the time argued that these numbers raised the question of who is in control of the department's mission, the private sector or our government. Well, before we can decide whether Senator Lieberman is right, we need to be aware that there are both positive and negative aspects to this privatization or outsourcing of American power. I want to start with the positive ones since these are often overlooked. Just as globalization makes government contracting and outsourcing more attractive, it also expands the possibilities for dependent action that has significant foreign policy impact. It is no exaggeration to say that it is now possible for individuals to make their own foreign policy when government falls short or lacks interest. And this is really the positive aspect of the privatization of American power, and we shouldn't lose sight of it in all the tales of waste, fraud, and abuse. I want to give you a couple examples of that just to illustrate. First example would be Sam Nunn's Nuclear Threat Initiative, if any of you are familiar with that. I think it really illustrates this new reality. The Nuclear Threat Initiative has successfully intervened abroad to fill a vacuum that would typically have been entirely covered by the US government. At Vinca in Belgrade, for example, the Nuclear Threat Initiative financed the flying of more than 100 pounds of potent nuclear material to Russia for blending down. There were a whole range of bureaucratic obstacles that kept the US government from being able to fund this initiative, and with federal funds. So the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a nonprofit organization, plugged the gap and covered the $5 million cleanup fee. It's also done similar things in Kazakhstan. Warren Buffett's $25 million matching pledge for a nuclear fuel bank. Many people are unaware of this, but he asked the Bush administration to put up a match of $25 million that would get them much closer to the $100 million goal that was needed to establish an international nuclear fuel bank. The White House said yes, and the Obama administration is currently pursuing that initiative. So that gives you an illustration of the difference that one individual can really make on the foreign policy front. A second example would be that of Kiva. If some of you are familiar with Kiva. Kiva's lending activities in Iraq are really interesting. They show how it's possible for innovative individuals to make diplomacy without explicit government authorization. Kiva, which means agreement in Swahili, uses the power of the internet to connect directly via PayPal willing citizens in the West who want to loan money for microfinance projects in the developing world. In May 2007, Kiva added the first Iraqi entrepreneurs to its website with the following disclaimer. This entrepreneur, this is the disclaimer, is from a volatile region where the security situation remains unsettled. Lenders to this business should be aware that this loan represents a higher risk and accept this additional risk in making their loan. So despite these warnings, all the loans were fully funded within a matter of hours, largely by American citizens who apparently wanted to lend a personal hand to the Iraqi reconstruction effort. And there are many, many other examples of the positive aspects of privatized power. Consider the relief effort in Haiti, which was almost wholly orchestrated by the private sector with the support of the Pentagon. Or think of the work of the Gates Foundation, or the Clinton Global Initiative, or the Grameen Bank. All have the virtue of a smaller US footprint, even though American philanthropy, and sometimes even your tax dollars, fund the work. Well, that brings me to the negative aspects of the outsourcing of American power. And the biggest is what I, in my book, call laissez-faire outsourcing. Laissez-faire outsourcing takes place when government outsources oversight as well as implementation. And the most glaring example of laissez-faire outsourcing is the Coast Guard's Deep Water program. Anybody familiar with the Deep Water program? It was launched in 2002 and was a 25-year plan, the most comprehensive in the Coast Guard's history, to modernize and update the Coast Guard's fleets of boats and aircraft. And the Coast Guard did something unprecedented with this project. They delegated overall management of the project to a contractor. So Integrated Coast Guard Systems, a joint venture of Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, was assigned the task of choosing who should perform the work, as well as the task of evaluating itself. Well, not surprisingly, Integrated Coast Guard Systems chose, guess who? Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman to do the lion's share of the work. And the results were catastrophic. 4 years into the program, the Coast Guard had fewer operational boats and ships than it had when Deepwater was first launched. And what had originally been a $17 billion project became a $24 billion one, practically overnight with no end in sight. One former Lockheed Martin engineer found that corruption was so rife that his only resource was to do something I'd never seen before. He posted a whistleblower video on YouTube. A new strategy. Well, what are the consequences of this? What are the consequences of government's laissez-faire outsourcing? I think there are at least three we need to talk about here today. The first is what I would call an accountability and oversight problem of unprecedented proportions. As of March 31st, 2010, Congress had appropriated $53 billion for reconstruction in Iraq and $51 billion for reconstruction in Afghanistan. Since the government wanted results yesterday, oversight was often the first casualty, inviting waste and corruption. To cite just one example, the Pentagon has publicly acknowledged that $8.2 billion of taxpayer money flowed through contracts into Iraq, sometimes in stacks or pallets of cash, without appropriate record keeping or oversight. For example, $68.2 million went to the United Kingdom, $45.3 million to Poland, and $21.3 million to South Korea. Yet Pentagon auditors were unable to say why the payments had been made. The second consequence of government's laissez-faire outsourcing is what I would characterize as an overly ambitious international agenda. That is, in many ways, contractors, because you can simply throw money at problems, they facilitate overextension. I think we can see this with the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where just imagine if we had to have a draft to fight those wars, which we would if we weren't able to rely on contractors. You would have a very different political situation in this country regarding decisions about the war going forward. But the third consequence, and which is perhaps the most troubling, is what I would call a lost sense of government purpose. That is, a lost sense of those things that only government can do well. And this has a highly demoralizing impact on everyone, especially those who work in government, who see most of the real work going out the door to contractors. Expediency, once this process is in motion, also makes it really easy to outsource things you shouldn't be outsourcing. In turn, our addiction to outsourcing has facilitated what I would call the inadvertent militarization of American foreign policy. By militarization, I simply mean the rise of the Pentagon as the go-to institution for getting things done under both the Clinton and the Bush administrations. And since many of the things that the Pentagon has been asked to do are outside its standard purview, DoD really became contracting central. The Department of Defense's faithful execution of government wishes is admirable, but just because the Pentagon is able to do something doesn't mean that it should be the one doing it. And I would argue that promoting American values through the US military overseas, which is a massive symbol of coercion rather than choice, usually undercuts the very values that we seek to promote. So what do we do about this? This is a problem. What is the way forward? In my book, I argue for a post-industrial foreign policy. That's the last chapter. And I lay out a number of maxims, things that we can do. I wanted to focus on just 3 of them here today and then open it up for discussion and see what sorts of things really interest you. The first thing we have to do is to demilitarize American foreign policy. Secretary Gates himself has warned of the creeping militarization of American foreign policy and its negative consequences. So this is not some kind of kooky left-wing academic imperative. It's something the Secretary of Defense also wants. If we look at the current ratio of military spending to civilian spending in the United States, it's now 10-1. Whereas if you compare us to the United Kingdom, that same ratio of military spending to civilian spending on international affairs is 3-1. So there's some room for change here without really losing anything in my view. The second aspect I'd like to highlight is what I call smart sourcing. I've been advising those that have asked me that what we really need is not insourcing, which is the instinctive Washington reaction. Just bring it all back in-house without really thinking what you're going to bring back in-house. I argue instead that we need smart sourcing. Well, what does that mean? I think it starts off by just acknowledging how governance itself has changed, acknowledging the centrality of contracting and the private sector in the work of government, and that means you've really got to recruit, train, and retrain a workforce of what I would call 21st century network managers, which is something government is not used to doing. So that's another way of saying part of our problem is we've got to reimagine government for the information age. But that's something that can be done. The second thing I think we need to do is, and I've argued for this on the Hill. I think I've testified 3 times in the last 3 months. And I've argued that we need to ban the use of moving armed contractors in war zones because soldiering is an inherently governmental function. I think our current dependence on weapon-wielding private actors has blurred the line between the legitimate and the illegitimate use of force, which is just what terrorists want. That's what they seek to do, is to blur that line. So in my view, we shouldn't be aiding them in that blurring. In devising plans for phasing out this practice, of course, we need to keep in mind that the reason the State Department hires armed contractors in war zones is because the military does not provide security, and the State Department doesn't have the in-house capacity. But I would argue we need to examine this problem and think about whether we want to continue the path we've chosen thus far. The third thing we need to do, and it's perhaps the most important, is embrace radical transparency. What do I mean by that? In theory, the information age has made transparency very easy. You can simply post all the relevant contracts and a clear record of how funds were expended on the web. And indeed, that's what websites like usaspending.gov do. Legislation was championed by then-Senator Barack Obama that gave us usaspending.gov, which has this tagline that says, where taxpayers can see how their money is spent. So that sounds really easy, but it turns out to be not so easy. Great strides have been made in providing information to the public on a variety of topics. You know, the stimulus package has its own website with information on contracts. The TARP does as well, financialstability.gov. But the one thing that is lacking is that information on subcontracts is unavailable. And this is extraordinarily important because much of this work gets done by executing a prime contract. And then that prime contractor can turn around and subcontract out the work. And that information is wholly unavailable to the public. We have legislation on the books that said that was supposed to be available as of January 1st, 2009. It is still not available. And what that means, I think, in practice, is that we're effectively pouring our taxpayer money into a black hole. And I think that's in nobody's interest, particularly the interest of the American taxpayer. It's a catastrophic state of affairs for both fiscal discipline as well as our cherished value of self-government. So if we are going to rely in unprecedented fashion on outsourcing the work of government to the private sector, both in wartime and peacetime, and both to for-profit and not-for-profit organizations, this spending has to take place in the full light of day. Americans need to be able to see where their tax dollars are going. And radical transparency, I would argue, will promote the right incentive structures for many of the people involved, which will preempt the need for unproductive regulation because you will be encouraging self-policing behavior. I strongly believe that what people do in the full light of day can be different from what they would be doing if they think that no one will ever discover anything they've done. So that's why I'm an advocate of radical transparencies. Lest I be misunderstood, I'm well aware that the demands of national security must sometimes trump the public's right to know. But this imperative can be so easily abused. Our enemy today is not another state, but a network of order-subverting terrorists and global challenges that transcend state borders. So fighting these new threats will demand unprecedented cooperation between the public and private sectors, unprecedented collaboration and information sharing between federal, state, and local government, and with our NATO allies. Transparency serves each of these ends rather than undermining them. So when our national security interests are properly understood, transparency does not threaten the national interest, but instead advances it. So I stand ready to be persuaded otherwise, but to date I have found most of the concerns about the costs of transparency to be misplaced, extensively focused on the short term at the expense of the sustainable, which is what we're all interested in. So while the inertia of the status quo is indisputably a powerful force, the positive aspects of the privatization of American power give us cause for hope. That is, when we look at foreign policy today as it really is, we see that there are plenty of things that citizens can do, strategies that can be pursued by the general public over the heads of both government and even business. So in conclusion, the outsourcing of American power ultimately means we need a brand new template for thinking about how government and the private sector should interact in the information age, both in wartime and in peacetime. The key players, however, are not just Wall Street and Washington, but each and every one of us. Thank you for your attention. I would welcome your questions.
Thank you for opening our eyes. You gave us an eye chart, so thank you. I'd like to invite you to ask questions, but please just wait until the microphone comes to you, and please identify yourself. So Susan, I guess.
Susan Gittleson. Thank you for providing the solutions for the future, but I'd like to go back to some of the problems. Now, usually in this country, since we believe in free enterprise, many business people in particular say you can't rely on the government bureaucrats, and you should really privatize and let American business know how to deal with these problems. But of course, you're showing some of the shortcomings on the private sector, and that's why it's so important to have a balancing and a critique, and someone like yourself coming along. Now, there's another issue, and that is generally outsourcing is used in a negative way when it comes to giving away American jobs to the Indians or the Chinese or whatever. And you probably just haven't had a chance to address this issue. But in this economy, a great concern is to find jobs for Americans, whether it's in the private sector or in government. So the fact that there are Americans doing all these things, one would think would be a positive. And
Yes.
We want to multiply the employment opportunities for Americans. Of course, we also want to interact with others, foreign policy, trade, and many other ways.
I think that's a really smart observation. And you're absolutely right. The whole impulse behind this privatization is a positive one. This is not a partisan issue. Both Democrats and Republicans alike embraced outsourcing the work of government to the private sector because precisely they wanted to get around slow, sclerotic government bureaucracy and get things done in an efficient and cost-effective manner. But what's happened is, without us realizing, is that that impulse has gone too far in a number of ways, because the private sector, as we've learned, it's not concerned. Its job isn't to concern itself with the public interest. Its job is to concern itself with making money and being viable and profit. We want it thinking about business, but we need government in that equation to ensure that things don't go off the rails. And that the real challenge is how you do that without, undermining the enormous energy, initiative, and innovation that the private sector brings to everything it tackles. So I'm bullish on the private sector, but even someone like Milton Friedman, a real advocate of minimalist government, saw government as having core functions. And we've lost that sense that there's anything that only government can do well, and I'm trying to restore that. With respect to jobs, this is where we have to examine this whole macro problem of chains of contracting and subcontracting. Because what often happens, and we can go through any sort of project, is that the jobs are not going to Americans. They're going, take private security contractors in Afghanistan. We had the Afghan first policy that actively sought to employ Afghans first. So the result is we have 95% of security contractors in Afghanistan today are local nationals. But this has caused a huge problem. Why? Both the House and the Senate have recently issued reports that show that taxpayer money is flowing through those contracts into the pockets of the Taliban. In other words, we are funding the people we are fighting against through this current system we have in place. And obviously that's in nobody's interest. So I just want us to examine the whole problem and think about it in a different way. But the first thing you have to do is just acknowledge that something fundamental has changed, which is hard for people to do. Thank you.
I have a question that relates to that.
Could you please identify?
Oh, Susan Roden. Okay, are the contracts put out for bids? And who reviews those bids? And why are the contracts given to companies that are going to subcontract it? You're just giving money to people who are going to make money, and then there's no oversight whatsoever. Why can't it go right to the subcontractor?
That's a great question, and that would obviously be wonderful for small business, because obviously, you know, if the same big companies are receiving the contracts, there's unlikely to be real competition. You're unlikely to reap the benefits of real free market competition if you have that kind of set of arrangements. So what I would suggest we do is consider who's going to be doing the work. And let me phrase this another way. What was your last question? Because I want to make sure I address it.
Why do we use subcontractors when we have to? Why is it to one contractor and subcontractor? Why can't we go directly to the subcontractor?
Great, thank you.
Put that out for bids.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to address. And the reason we can't do it, particularly with wartime contracting, is wartime contracting is emergency contracting. And a lot of contracting is emergency contracting. The TARP had emergency contracting authority, for example. The problem, and in those situations, you just want to get the work done, and you suspend a lot of the usual rules. But this is problematic because if you're in a state of emergency for 8-9 years, this is going to do all kinds of things to your country's bottom line. Most people don't realize that when I quoted those numbers from the State Department and the Department of Defense, 82% of the budget going out the door in contracts and grants for DOD, 83% of the State Department's requested budget. The reason those numbers are so large is that we're funding these wars through supplemental appropriations, not through regular budgetary procedures. So that's another green light for laissez-faire contracting. Just, okay, we need this job done. Someone do it, and we don't care how it gets done.
You wouldn't hire a plumber that way.
You wouldn't, and that's why I'm trying to get us to sort of step back and say, what are we doing? And acknowledge that this is really in nobody's interest to continue down the path we've embarked upon. Thank you. Can you hear me when I'm feeling like I have to stand here to speak into the microphone, but I want to. Okay. Is it okay? Can I move around? Okay.
Richard Valcourt, International Journal of Intelligence. Of course, contracting is a big factor in our business as well. But since you dealt with the Defense Department, in more recent times, we're depending on an all-volunteer force in the military. And so the contractors are filling the void, the personnel void, in most of these situations. So how do you fill that void? Do you, at this point, perhaps advocate the reinstitution of the military draft, and perhaps in this case, universal military training, since the military services are now kind of integrated gender? So you have both men and women with filling the void, again, as government employees in the service, to fill some of the gap personnel-wise and eliminate the reliance on the contractors.
Wonderful question. I think we really have to restore the notion of national service, however we can, not just in the military, but national service more broadly defined. My biggest concern about this country today is that we have become a nation of consumers, and we need to return to being a nation of citizens. And so if a national service requirement of some sort, either military or otherwise, would advance that aim, I would definitely be in support of it. But I'm a little bit uncomfortable about fighting wars that you simply throw money at, because it isn't good. It seems like it's good for our economy because it's government spending injected into the economy, but I'm not convinced it has positive long-term consequences. And there's something also disturbing about fighting wars when the public is really disengaged from them. War is serious business, and we're here to talk about ethics in international affairs. It strikes me that fighting wars in this way is ethically problematic. So you put your finger on a very important point.
It's a similar question to the one that was just asked about use of professional armies and what you said about sort of a loss of civic virtue.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that one of the big problems is the transfer of people who've been in procurement on the government side, whether on the executive branch or working in legislatures, mm-hmm. Moving then over onto the side either as consultants or working for the people who are contracting with the government. And I know in your book you talk about the need for some kind of restriction on the ability to move backwards and forwards. And I think if mm-hmm. there could be a solution, we see the problem in many other areas. I mean, we see it with people who've worked for the SEC, then going to work for the institutions that they were regulating. Mm-hmm. And there's always the suspicion that maybe the possibility of a future lucrative job causes you not to be as rigorous as you might otherwise be. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a solution to this problem, which obviously isn't very easily available, a model that involved some sort of mechanism to solve this would be useful in many areas of government procurement, not just in military spending.
No, it's an excellent point, and obviously it's a real conundrum because you want the expertise of people in government, and so some sense that revolving door serves that end of getting people really in the know in positions of power. Unfortunately, it often sets up very perverse incentive structures. You know, we're sort of assuming that the private sector is comprised of angels, that they're able to don different hats in different situations and not be compromised by enormous temptations. I believe there are extraordinary individuals out there who can weather that challenge, but I think most people can't. And so you need to have some sort of system in place that addresses that problem. If you look at the oil and gas lobby, for example, 75%, the Washington Post reported, of the oil and gas lobby are former government employees. And I've seen this pattern myself in doing work for government, where just when college tuitions come due, you know, the financial sacrifices really make themselves felt. That's precisely the moment where going to work for a contractor is enormously appealing. It serves your family. But that kind of set of incentive structures is really a problem. Because if you're supposed to be regulating, and you're thinking down the road for your own self-interest, that you'd like to have that job with the private sector someday, that's probably going to influence how you regulate. So I'm increasingly convinced we need some sort of regulation mechanism that's akin to the Supreme Court, where it's an enormous honor to be appointed to this body, whatever it might be, and that's your job for life. So you have all the experience, and then, you know, the crown jewel would be to be put in charge of the public interest in this sort of way. So that's the sort of idea that I've been thinking about. Now getting that into place is enormously challenging, but you can do intermediate things with limits on the amount of time one has to sit out before one can go back in, and I think that takes care of a big part of the problem. But what's clear to me is the system we have today is assuming that men are angels. You know, Madison told us that if men were angels, government would be entirely unnecessary.
Hi, Carol Spomer.
Hi.
It seems to me that outsourcing greatly masks the number of people dying and being maimed in the war efforts,
Mm-hmm.
because it's the troops that are being reported as lives lost. And it seems that the budget then, with outsourcing, is treated differently, so it makes it more difficult to pinpoint the enormous cost of the full effort. My question is, do you feel that there is a purposeful attempt to manage public opinion by reducing casualties, losses of lives, and the monies expended by so doing?
That's a super question, because initially, when you see this problem, and this is what ordinary Americans think, right? When I go out around the country talking about my book in the Midwest and so forth, people are really convinced that there's some sort of conspiracy out there, that government is doing this intentionally because it's putting government work off the radar screen. Whenever you contract out, you can't be criticized. And it's true. You contract the work out, and it's suddenly shrouded in secrecy in a way it wouldn't be if you were a government employee. Similarly, you contract the work out. Suddenly, government ethics standards don't apply to the person who's working as a contractor, even though they're ostensibly doing government work. So this is the standard response, is there's some kind of conspiracy at work. And what my experience has been, and what I've seen, is that this is just something that's happened slowly over time by well-intentioned people doing what they thought was best for their country. And now it's time to just step back and say, we understand how this happened. Nobody is to blame. I really don't think a particular party is to blame for this, even though a lot of it was accelerated under the Bush administration because wartime contracting involves such immense sums of money. But that's no point of departure for solving the problem. The importance is to acknowledge this change has taken place and have a public discussion about how best to get the country back on course. I think the American people are hungry for that kind of conversation and would look like, frankly, to have some leadership from people in positions of power on those issues. And I hope we'll see that in the future. The Congress seems to be focusing in on this more and more. When I first started my research, the standard response I would get from people in Washington was, nothing's changed. This is how it looks if you've been sitting in the same seat for a long time. It's just more of the same. But that's why I hope that my kind of what I would call a Green Mountain perspective from the outside can illuminate some patterns that are more difficult to see if you're close to them. So let's acknowledge there's a problem. Once you acknowledge there's a problem, you can do something about it. And that's what I'm trying to do by going around talking about it.
Howard Lentner. As you indicate, I think that this means the erosion of the democratic system in the United States, and so the question is, how do we restore it? Mm-hmm. It seems to me that one major contributing factor is ideology, that the neoliberal ideology that private sector does mm-hmm. things well and the government really is incompetent has been a very powerful contributor to this development. And I wonder if you see any erosion of that ideology, or do you think it's as strong as ever? And the other thing is, I think about how do we get this into the public process? Do you see any? Have you identified any groups or individuals advocating the recapture of a public interest and trying to find some way of bringing these matters into the debate?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I think we're at a really critical moment in this country. And it's interesting because when I go back and read, I've been reading a lot of Thomas Jefferson lately for fun in the morning. And if you go back and read the Founding Fathers, you'll discover some really interesting things. What you'll discover is that Thomas Jefferson says on a number of occasions that the whole reason the American experiment can work is because we don't have the vast disparities in wealth that Europe has. He says if we ever had those, the system would not function as we intended. That's essentially what he says. And so when you read those founding debates in the Federalist Papers, I have this very powerful sense that we've reached a moment in American history where we need to have similar debates, and we need similar great minds to map out solutions, because the old solutions don't work. We know that turning the clock back and reinstituting top-down government is a recipe for disaster. I came to this topic. I was a student of Soviet foreign policy. I am well acquainted with command economy. So anybody who starts to tell me, we just need more government employees and we need the government to do this, I instinctively respond negatively. So it's not going to work to do that, but at the same time, to continue what we're doing now is a recipe for financial ruin. So we really are at this moment where we need to return to kind of big-scale, almost constitutional questions, and that leads me to tell you about a movement. You asked about movements. There is a movement. Anybody familiar with Larry Lessig, professor at Harvard Law School? He has an organization called Change Congress. They are the institutors of the Coffee Party. It's supposed to be the counterpart to the Tea Party. In other words, you look at the Tea Party and they're raged about a number of things, and some of their arguments are disturbing, but their core reaction is one that's shared on both the left and right. So how do you channel that energy, that anger, into something constructive and positive? And Lessig is arguing that we need, and I don't necessarily agree with this, a new constitutional convention. He wants us to reconvene everybody because he thinks that's the only way you can initiate a public debate. I hear that and I start thinking, I'm thinking about, the Tea Party contributing enormously to that debate and where it might go given the current divisiveness in this country. But I think that's where we're at. A constitutional moment where tinkering isn't going to take us where we need to go.
Mary?
No, she answered my
Oh,
question.
she answered.
Thank you.
Did I miss anyone? Or? Well, then I just really want to thank you for a really
Sure.
wonderful discussion. It was really
Great. Thank you.